Hi everyone, it's Brian Walker, CEO and founder of Retail Doctor Group, and thank you for joining us on our Future of Retail podcast series. Steve Dennis is really a true global retail influencer, a wonderful author. For those who've read some of his work, Leaders Leap, Remarkable Retail, and a podcast host himself. Steve is also the owner of Sageberry Consulting, very renowned consulting practice. Good morning, good afternoon, Steve.
Nice to see you again, Brian. Thanks for having me on.
You speak of the bifurcation of retail. I love the term. How do we summarize that? What does that mean? It's a wonderful word, but I'm trying to understand what you mean by it.
Well, I've been criticized for using it a little bit too much, but I guess I started down this path. I started to notice the phenomenon, but I guess I started talking about retail's great bifurcation probably about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more, because what I was noticing and what I mean by it was really this split where success was being seen more and more, it seemed, at two ends of the spectrum. And in fact, there's a Deloitte study that quantifies this subsequently better than I could. But really, it was this idea that lots of growth, lots of success was being found really on more the value, convenience, price end of the spectrum. So that's, I guess, most easily thought about with retailers like Walmart and Amazon, but others. And then success and store growth being found really at the other end of the spectrum, which was not necessarily luxury, but really more premium, more specialty, more focused kind of retailers. And then this kind of vast, messy, murky, boring, whatever you want to call it, mediocre middle, that was where most of the troubles in retail were starting to occur. And then I really think since that 10, 12 years ago, whenever I first got onto it, I've really only seen that accelerate.
And will continue to accelerate into the future, I suspect. We talk in a similar vein. It's interesting where we look at the way scale, the role of technology clearly, really exaggerates the momentum of some of these larger organizations at some level.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And at the other end, we're seeing, we would say, the renaissance of the curated, localized retail.
Yeah, right.
And what you talk about in unremarkable retail, we're probably a little bit more colloquial and call it the fat middle as such, where differentiation is getting increasingly challenging.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, at one level, this is probably pretty obvious, and I don't want to make this a history lesson, but if you go back 20, 30 years, I think in most countries, certainly in yours and mine, you had a lot of success with kind of the category killer style retailer, a little bit of everything for everybody in a general area. But of course, way back when, 95, 96, 97% of all retail was done in a physical store. So if you wanted to see that great assortment, for the most part, I mean, there were obviously, e-commerce has been around for a while, mail order catalogs have been around for a while. So this is not a black and white statement, but that was really, really interesting to be able to see kind of the long tail, so to speak, of, the way we talk about it for the last couple of decades. You had to go to a physical place to see it. And that works great, really more on, as you say, on the scale side, where it's kind of everything for a low price. But when you start to get into other categories and maybe you want that depth of merchandise, well, once the internet came along, that was increasingly less interesting. So actually trying to be a little bit of everything to everybody had started to being really nothing powerful for anybody. And so I think that has really pushed the polls or pushed this bifurcation forward.
So when we talk about unremarkable retail, that's fairly self-evident, and I think you capture that well. Going into the future, what does remarkable retail start to look like?
Well, I think one of the points, and this, and I'll get a little bit more to your future question, but, the other thing I started to notice was in a world of incredible choice, in a world of, easy access, 24/7, ability to get products, information becoming ubiquitous, I think the pressure that put on retailers was, how do you deliver even greater customer value? Because when you were limited to choice, largely physically, then you could just be very good and often still win the customer's world. So this idea of remarkable, I use it, as I think I use it in the more commonly accepted way of something unique, differentiated, et cetera. But that's always been important. But how I use it more of the way Seth Godin does in his book Purple Cow is something that people will really talk about. But part of that is, how do you really do something powerful? How do you have that emotional connection? And so I think the more choice becomes exacerbated, the more that, particularly in an era where agentic commerce is coming about, when you're when you're using AI in various ways to try to find that best choice. Well, if you're just slightly better than average, you may not even get noticed in the first place. So I think it's become more and more important to be truly remarkable, to amplify the wow, as I like to say it. But I think as the world moves forward, at least to the extent we can predict where it's going, it only becomes even more and more important. So this is another kind of bifurcation, which is, these super scalers, which are a little bit of everything, that can become a race to the bottom, or it's almost impossible for you to win, because if you don't have the scale of a hypermarket or the scale of some of these other, Amazon and others, how you get any sort of competitive advantage. So you really got to get out of the middle, and you're pushed, if you're more to the kind of specialty side. Well, what is that point of differentiation? What is that incredible customer value? And I think that's both about narrowing your customer focus, but then really distorting the value for that set of customers. And the retailers that get into trouble, they either try to out Walmart or out Walmart or out Amazon, and that's impossible, or they just don't create enough differentiation because they're not customer focused enough, or
Yeah.
even if they are, they're not delivering enough value. Now, that value might be incredible environment, unique assortment. I mean, there's lots of ways you can deliver that, really, and it's probably not just one thing, but a set of things. So you got to aim higher in the value you deliver, and then I think just in
Yeah.
terms of keeping up, you have to move faster, or you're just likely to fall further and further behind.
This moving faster, I do want to touch on, but one thing I think is sort of evidential and a bit of a lens into the future. As you know, in your country, there's over 1 million registered retail establishments of varying sizes.
Yeah.
And over 40% of all US retail trade is done by 10 of those retailers:
Right.
Walmart, Costco, Amazon, and so forth.
Yeah.
So the other 60% share 999.9 thousand or
Right.
thereabouts.
Right. Yeah.
And so if we glance into the future and we think about this bifurcation and we think about where this is all going, and as population density increases, per capita spend will remain pretty static in that
Right.
mix.
Yeah.
There has to be imminent shakeout, doesn't there, moving into the
Oh,
future?
for sure. And it's actually a little bit worse, I think, in some respects, in the way because in the last couple of years, if you look at incremental growth, over 50% of the incremental sales growth has gone to only 3 retailers. So this content, I call it the great concentration, seems to be going on. Now that's sales. I think if you were to do it on a profit basis, it would be even worse. And then you also have an incredible concentration in e-commerce growth. For example, Walmart growing at something like, I think it's 23% in
Yes.
e-commerce. So yeah, it's a real challenge. And I think when many markets are faced with still continuing inflation issues, if you've got a high fixed cost base, as if you're physically retail dominant, obviously that's a big component. You're not able to
Yeah.
move that top line, and maybe you're getting squeezed on labor costs, occupancy costs, freight costs, you name it. It's going to force more and more retailers out of business. I think, unfortunately, we've been seeing that for a long time, at least in this country. I mean, we've seen quite a lot of store closings, but we're also seeing a lot of store openings. So, I mean, it really is a tale of two cities, where the
It
powerful
is.
winning retail formats are growing much, much faster than even the average retailer, much less the lagging retailer. So it's a
Yeah.
very, very fraught period, I think, for retail in many countries.
Yeah. And one other point that comes to mind here, I think if I think of the Amazon model and the Walmart model and so forth, the product per se is not the central differentiator. The sort of the
Right,
points of difference are speed, Prime, web engine services in Amazon's example, the building of this partner network, the
right,
integration with technology.
Right.
So I think scale is driven by other factors than the classic retail. Retail product is
Right.
almost the enabler to move into people's homes. And I think in the US, is it over 60% of residents are Prime subscribers, for example.
Yeah, I
So,
think it's even a little bit higher.
uh,
Yeah, it's funny. You might get the next time you're in this country, you might get beat up because I often get pushback from some of my friends in merchandising who say it's all about product, and I'm like, well, that's demonstrably not true. I mean, I'm not saying product is not important, and
it's a it's
clearly
a
for
hygiene
certain
factor
types of
now, isn't it?
retailers
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
way more important. But the way you point out, I mean, it's not hard to come up with examples of retailers, as you say, that differentiate on things other than products necessary, but it's not sufficient, as well as things like bottled water, where the same water, more or less, or the same wine can have very big price differentials. Skin creams, like there's so many products that the product features themselves, customers can't even tell the difference. And there's huge price differences. So that's about, branding more than, as you say, supply chain fulfillment, technology advantages for sure. And I think, the other thing, just to kind of come back on a point I was making earlier, if you're one of those, whether it's 40% as you mentioned, or whether it's 80% or whatever, however we think about all the other retailers that aren't those super scalers, well, then what do you need to do to just even maintain kind of the table stakes levels of customer experience, of supply chain efficiency? I mean, that is really, really daunting. And, fortunately, there are some ways from SaaS providers, Shopify. I mean, there are ways to kind of
Yeah.
neutralize that, but it does frighten me to think of what it takes to keep up with the absolute best in retail in many areas.
One other topic that links to this into the future, and we're seeing it now with the Walmart AI agentic type deals. Over here in Australia, we've got Woolworths doing deals with Google such that
Hmm.
if I'm a supermarket shopper, I go onto my AI agentic search, it determines where the product is from Woolworths in this example, links up to
Hmm.
menus,
Yeah.
delivery, the whole 9 yards.
Hmm.
And I'm not actually doing business with Woolworths per se. I'm
Right.
doing it with an agentic AI intermediate.
Yep.
And and what that ultimately will start to do, I suspect, is start to compress range. It'll
Hmm.
start to determine what I will buy. In will come predictive solutions and so forth. And so, and obviously all that entails. If we look into the future, Steve, it changes the dynamic of the classic customer retailer relationship, doesn't it? Potentially.
Oh, I think, right. I think well, I guess my disclaimer is I think things are moving so quickly, and I do not pretend to be an expert on agentic AI. So with that caveat, I'll be a
Oh,
little cautious
I'm a
about how
curious
far I lean
observer.
forward on this. But I mean, I do think that it's hard not to see how this sort of technology in various iterations isn't fundamentally transformative, perhaps in a way that the advent of e-commerce was. Now, I still think, just as I've said about e-commerce, and push back against this idea that everything's moving online, which, people have been saying that for a long time. And at least in this
Yeah, no,
country,
I
we're
don't
still at about
subscribe to that either.
20%, and physical
Yeah.
retail has continued to grow. So the answer is it depends a lot on the nature of what you're shopping for, how much you value brands, et cetera, et cetera. But
Human
I think,
experience.
yeah, right, right. So but there's no question the potential is enormous. Potential for disintermediation, uh, as we like to say, some of us like to say,
Yes.
I think is enormous. And I would be, if anything, I think it leads more to the collapse of the unremarkable middle for multi-line retailers in particular, because if there isn't something fundamental about your business model, like I'm not saying that Amazon and others won't come under pressure, but I think if you've got relationships with certain retailers and it becomes your default, you still may end up buying a lot in that style of retailing. So I think agentic commerce lends itself to more. I used to work in luxury at Neiman Marcus, and of course we had a lot of personal, sales associates that behaved as personal shoppers and put outfits together. Well, the ability to automate that, as well as some people either don't I mean, not to get into the weeds on this, but in many cases, the personal shopping model works better for the very top tier customers because the sales associates want to spend time on the big spenders. Well, this kind of democratizes that aspect of it, but also a lot of people are intimidated by the
Yeah.
process of dealing with it. Well, now you just sit at home or on your phone and make this happen. Not only uh, as well as was previously available, but in many cases, much, much better because of the speed of it and the ability to, iterate through options. So I think it's very, very significant. I think we're very much in early days. I'm not about to predict who the winners are going to be
Yeah.
in this. It's
Yeah.
inevitable that there'll be advertising models. I mean, I think we're already starting to see that. And so that changes the game or shifts the way it might evolve. But yes, it is. That was a long-winded way of saying it's huge. I don't think it is going to change everything. As some people, I often say, hyperbole is the greatest thing ever, and there's a lot of hyperbolic statements. But
Yes.
it is massive, and I think anybody who is not spending a lot of time trying to understand what it means for them and experimenting is very, very likely to get left behind.
Well, it's interesting, we have retailers still grappling with legacy point of sale systems and
Sure.
data consolidation and collab. So at a primary level, getting that data sorted and really understanding the topic of agentic AI is absolutely leans into the future. I think you touched on, Steve, and sort of the last point that I want to chat to you today about was this concept that we would call time as a currency.
Hmm.
And we've observed this idea of time. Now, if we start to see, and I don't think it is, by the way, that speed is a strategy, ultimately, as time compresses, experience compresses,
Hmm.
margin compresses, and it's ultimately a race to the bottom. And so, retailers that can think fast and slow into the future, I think, will be better
Hmm.
positioned.
Sure.
We don't have same day delivery for Rolex, but we do for
Mhm.
groceries.
Right.
And it's that sort of thinking. And I'm interested in your view on this idea of everything getting faster. Ultimately, that's just a baseline entry for many categories.
Yeah, I guess I have a few thoughts. I mean, first, I don't, the example you use where people, oftentimes I just push back where people say, convenience is everything. And then the same people a few months later say experience is everything. And I'm like, well, which is it? Well, the answer is it depends, right? Speed is
Yeah.
incredibly important in certain things. And some very, very famous retailers are famously not speedy at all, right? People are waiting for Birkin bags for a long time and standing in line at
Yes.
the Apple store. So, and those are, Hermes, Apple, I think are, top five most valuable retailers on the planet. So, and with enormous margins. So anyway, but I think one is there are a few things I think you have to accept, or understand and probably accept and act on, which is the pace of change for the most part is only accelerating. I would generally believe that the world will be more different in the next 5 years than it was in the past 15. And so now that won't be true for everything. Um, so what I talk about, and it's the subtitle of my second book, Leaders Leap, is transforming at the speed of disruption, which begs the question, what do I mean by the speed of disruption? And the answer is you have to understand that for your own particular neck of the woods. If you were in the fast fashion business, as an example, Temu and Shein became multi-billion-dollar brands very, very quickly, and in many cases really hurt some of the traditional fast fashion type of players and others. I usually use my dry cleaner as an example. I think the speed of disruption in the dry cleaning business is quite slow. And so I don't think they need to be spending a lot of time, maybe on robots or something, but they don't need to be spending a lot of time in AI. I don't think that's likely to disrupt the dry cleaning business very much. So you really have to understand, your mileage may vary, the speed of disruption for your business really varies. But if you're not, I think the overall leadership point is, if you're not really paying attention to the speed of disruption and you're not kind of opening the aperture in terms of things that might be disruptive to, famously, I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar, at least generally, with the innovator's dilemma. So many companies that get disrupted by insurgents that come from outside the industry and approach the solution in a very different way. In this country, Blockbuster in the video game retail business was completely disrupted by Netflix, which was a startup, 15 years ago or 13 years ago,
Mm.
whenever they started. So anyway, I think you have to open the aperture. You have to be very creative about things that could change. You have to be paying attention to how fast things are happening. And just because things like generative AI are happening very, very quickly doesn't necessarily mean you need to jump in full bore. That being
Yeah.
fast, being built for speed is not the same as being reckless. But understanding the risk of moving slowly is things a lot of retailers that have gotten into trouble have fundamentally misunderstood. And the thing I worry about a lot, and again, if this idea that change tends to be happening more exponential than linearly, it's very easy to get behind, and it's more and more difficult to catch up in many areas if you don't. So you really need to get this right. That doesn't mean be first mover. Like I say, that doesn't mean be reckless. That doesn't mean leap on the bright shining object. I spent a bunch of time 20 years ago working on Second Life and MySpace strategies. Well, that was, turned out not to be a big thing. And a lot of people spend a lot of money on metaverse strategies. That has turned out not to be such a big thing. So just because something gets a lot of hype and maybe even getting some investment interest doesn't mean you need to jump all over it.
Steve, there is one last question. If you're a board member or a CEO and you might have a $50 million plus business for the sake of the discussion,
Mm-hmm.
and you're listening to this podcast and you're leaning into all the topics that we've talked about,
Yeah.
some are timeless, differentiation, the wow factor, as you rightfully say, all those are timeless. But faced with technology, faced with a generational change of consumer, change, faced with emerging better and better competition, what's one or two things you'd say to think about into the future?
Well, one thing, and I hesitate to mention this, is are you really customer centric? Are you really customer obsessed? Whatever. Lots of companies say it. Very few do that well. So I would be really honest about, do you know enough about the customer? Are you acting on it? Are you treating different customers differently? Those kinds of things. But I think the other ones are understanding your relationship to risk. Not that I came up with this, but I often talk about safe is risky. In a world that's changing very, very fast, going slow and steady is often the riskiest thing of all. But I think most cultures are wired to think more
Yeah.
incrementally, and we assess, we do spreadsheets and scenario planning to decide whether we want to do something. But often in the conversation is, well, what's the risk of not doing something in this area? So your relationship to risk, I
Yes.
think, is very important to understand. And then I think, two other things I guess I'll say quickly. One is
Yeah, please.
it's more important to be or to move to a more agile model. And I don't necessarily mean sort of agile software development, but do you have enough agility in your operating model? Because when things are changing very, very quickly and it's hard to know what the future looks like, you have to build agility into your operating model. And, that's always been important, but I think, the lessons from COVID are, obviously pointed out some of the issues with very fixed supply chains and the like, but I think that's a more holistic thing. And then the last one, but it's related, is do you really have a culture of experimentation? And I wrote something the other day, which is stolen from my book, which is what I call ABT, A always, B T testing, always be testing. But the thing is to do it intelligently, like have lots of experiments, but also be able to really be able to measure them and stop doing things. Because I see this a lot. Things live beyond their useful life. And I often say quitting is underrated. Like that's the smartest thing to do if it opens you up to do other things. But also when things are working, do you have the ability to really put fuel on the fire, so to speak? And I see that a lot too, where organizations are trying enough, but then it's like, oh, we don't have the budget to scale this. And, and then you get into a big argument and then you just get stuck. So anyway, that'll be
Oh,
a
I
few
think that's
things.
good. I think that's very true. And my very similar view of this is that we're trying to innovate, trying to meet the future, stay with the pace of it or ahead of it, however we perceive. But we're using constructs, board governance, risk, executive reporting, P&Ls, et cetera, that come out of another generation that were
Right.
all about control, effectively
Yeah.
about control. And so the
Yeah,
antithesis of innovation and risk is control.
yeah, and I have a slight. I agree with that very much, and I have a slightly different frame, which I get out a little bit in Leaders Leap, which is, and I used to open some keynotes I was doing a few years ago, where I won't go through the whole thing, but basically I was saying, is it possible that basically that what got you here won't get you where you need to
Yeah.
go? But also then the real, sort of provocation on that is not only will it not, the skills and capabilities you had, not only are they not so relevant, but they might actually get in the way of you making the changes you must. And I think that really causes boards and leadership teams to really get honest about what they're doing and is it serving them well. Sometimes I sound a little bit like a self-help guru, but or a therapist, like, well,
No,
how's that
no,
helping
but I
you?
understand.
Relying on that. But I think it's really, it takes a certain amount of self-awareness and challenge to yourself, but also to your team of like, well, why do we keep doing that?
Yeah.
And are there other things or other voices or other ways of doing things that might actually really help us? And so, yeah, I think a lot of what made I just, talking about from an individual leadership standpoint, I think a lot of things that have made various executives really successful just don't serve them very well and maybe getting in the way. So I think it's a great conversation to kind of have you with yourself, do a little bit of introspection. But I often recommend in leadership teams, like that's a great topic, whether it's a strategy retreat or a quarterly review or a weekly staff meeting, whatever, to really talk about that. And that makes, you have to be vulnerable to do that, right? Because you have to admit you're wrong maybe, or you have to get really honest with yourself. And that's not usually the kind of typical thing that you see in a lot of corporate cultures.
Steve, what a terrific session. Now, I know that we'll probably have 2 episodes out of this, but I'm thinking also we'll have to get you down under, as you would say, into Australia and do a little bit of a tour, because this is absolutely phenomenal and greatly appreciate. I hope everyone's enjoyed this as much as I have, Steve Dennis. And do please read Steve's wonderful books, Remarkable Retail, Leaders Leap. This is a man whose opinion I deeply respect. And Steve, thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, the honor is mine, and I really appreciate you having me on.